This essay is about education, school reform, school choice, and charter schools.
I am honored to become a wildcat.
Actually, let me start elsewhere.
And my father sort of influenced me. He says, if you learn to write, if you read a lot, if you sort of figure that part out, then you can figure out stories. But the path to being a filmmaker is not about the equipment or the technique. It's about stories.
Maybe this is about how stories eventually become more than just stories. It's been 10 years now since the documentary Waiting for Superman came out. For a passionate storyteller, Davis Guggenheim, the film's director, his mandate seemed fairly simple: help audiences live the stories of young, ambitious kids and watch as they get crushed under the weight of a broken education system. And that despite their best merits, despite their parents' efforts to support their success, their potential is ultimately robbed. His goal was to then use these stories to diagnose the ailments of that broken system and showcase the valiant efforts of reformers and innovators who are simply fed up with the status quo. Waiting for Superman typified a huge turning point in education policy in the US. It helped ignite a national movement to scrutinize public schools and spark protracted debates around school choice, teachers' unions, charter schools, accountability, and privatization. At the time of this recording, it has been a solid decade since the film was released. Now that we've had a period of time to think about it, just what has been the legacy of this film? Has the state of U.S. education at all improved thanks to the efforts of these, quote, reformers? Have more kids of disadvantaged backgrounds benefited from these shakeups? Did they have better chances at life success? Has the massive expansion of charter schools lived up to its promise? Do teachers' unions suck the education system dry to prop up lazy teachers in a cycle of wasteful bureaucracy? In other words, did this documentary finally figure out the secret sauce to improve the lives of poor kids? If you haven't seen the movie, perhaps you remember this scene from the trailer.
Almost every category we've fallen behind, except one. Kids from the USA ranked #1 in confidence.
This was my first memory as a mindless 20-something struggling to find stable employment after the financial crisis. I recall a majority of my 20s were spent feeling up creek, and I traded in my paddle for a useless social science degree. I love nonfiction, and I'm obsessed with documentaries. In fact, convinced that I never got over my ADHD, and feeling like I sucked at reading so much that I declared to myself that the only way for me to get smarter was to be infotained. I loved documentaries of the 2000s. They all fed my idealistic mind, which was fresh from undergrad. I had somehow thought if I watched enough, I could be this scene from Good Will Hunting.
Say I'm working at the NSA and somebody puts a code on my that code was the location of some rebel army
in North Africa or the Middle government that would sell us oil at a good spills the oil and kills all the sea life in the North Atlantic because the shrapnel in his ass is giving him chronic hemorrhoids.
Popular culture began to take a little bit more of a different tone, more toward what I would say are more overtly political messages, with clear indictments of the Bush administration over the war in Iraq, corporate power, the culture wars in general. A lot of these were thrust into the national spotlight. All of a sudden, you find yourself talking about bowling for Columbine during Thanksgiving with your aunts and uncles, talking about the appalling state of gun control in the US. Oh, and there was also March of the Penguins. The 90s and before certainly had strong political themes, but did not seem to thrust itself in the national conversation, especially along the more clearly defined political narratives and battle lines expressed in the era of Fox News and Jon Stewart. Fast forward to 2010, the Bush era is well over, Obama steps in, and finally a prominent documentary feature arrives about our education. You might have also remembered this memorable quote from the trailer by DC School Chancellor Michelle Rhee.
So you think that most of the kids here are getting a crappy education right now?
Oh, I don't think they are. I know they are.
I could do a retrospective on the more famous titles like Bowling for Columbine and An Inconvenient Truth, but there was a special intrigue to me about Waiting for Superman. You were able to observe a very interesting narrative arc of a movement, a very lively period of famous people, the mega rich, savvy politicians, a discourse of earth-shattering entrepreneurial ideas and philanthropists ready to move mountains with their money, all a part of the effort to engineer the change that they wanted to see. I'm lucky enough today to say that I eventually climbed out of my old phase of dejection and unemployment, and now get to think about social change and the mechanics of movements like these as an actual profession. For the last 10 years, this documentary has been stuck in the back of my mind, I'd say. So consider this an attempt for me to spill it out and free myself from it once and for all.
Stereotyping everywhere you go. They're a little more vocal about it, but honestly, as an African American, I'm used to it.
Waiting for Superman was not Guggenheim's first documentary feature on schools. Previously, he created films documenting the work of public school teachers, especially exceptional ones dedicated to their craft. It was clear that he saw them as undervalued, underappreciated, and though being thoroughly inspired by these public school teachers, he opts to put his kids in private school. The strong suit of this movie comes through the individual stories of children, often poor, yet amped about their studies, who, at no fault of their own, cannot find the opportunity for a great education. The movie illustrates the realities faced by the working class, by people of color, and does a very nice job of humanizing their struggle through the stories of Anthony, a kid in the ailing Washington, D.C. school system, Daisy, a kid in South Central Los Angeles, Bianca, a mother working 2 jobs just to place her child in better schools. Their stories culminate in the moment they await the results of an admissions lottery into higher quality charter schools. It signals to the audience that this will be their only chance to escape nightmarish public school systems, and thus a lifetime of disadvantage, of delinquency, their futures just hanging on by the luck of the draw. Let's just get this out of the way. The movie did make me tear up just a bit. Daisy! No! No, Daisy! The more controversial aspect of the movie focuses on just what the hell we should be doing about it, which mirrors the tenets of the school reform movement. The tenets are as follows. Public schooling in America is pathetic. The government and teachers' unions represent a status quo and will go out of their way to make sure no aspect of that pathetic system changes, including its burdensome regulations, which allow for teachers and administrators to continually fail our children with no consequences, and that the only solution is to break from the confines of the status quo, allow parents and their children an alternative to the sinking ship, the freedom to choose other options, namely charter schools, or public schools using public funds to be brought under private control, which would usher in competition and accountability to basically uncorrupt the system and keep it honest. When you look at things like spending statistics, quote, the blob, or the mess of regulations, which form the debilitating bureaucracy, the scorn-inducing portrait of lemon teachers who get paid to do nothing but hang out in so-called rubber rooms and collect a paycheck, the political clout of the unions that supposedly want none of this to go away, you could very well come away with the understanding that the system is indeed broken, and this film has revealed a bold answer. Well, I guess it's been 10 years. The documentary garnered a fair amount of success. Its message percolated widely and catalyzed a great deal of public debate. It elevated the reputations of a handful of educators, politicians, and philanthropists as faces of the educational reform movement. A strong advocacy campaign accompanied the release of the film. Just a year after its release, the film had been credited with spurring millions in donations to over 2.8 million children. Tens of thousands of independent showings or town hall meetings were organized to help spread the message. They even did a study funded by Waiting for Superman's production company, Participant Media. They found that a vast majority of viewers found the film to be factually accurate, emotionally moving, and saying that they were in better positions to be a part of a social movement to improve public education. The children of the film were invited to the White House.
I want you guys to stay focused and work hard and listen to your pulse.
Secretary of Education under Obama at the time, Arne Duncan, was a huge fan, and even went so far as to call the film a Rosa Parks moment.
You can't look in those children's eyes and those parents' eyes and walk away and do nothing. You have to get off the sidelines, and that's why I call it a Rosa Parks moment.
The film helped plant a seed into the larger discourse on education policy, which, for the last 10 years, helped the massive rise of charter schools all across the country and a deep shakeup of public education. The film is not without its meh elements. Let's just look at the film itself. Though these kids came from public school, none of their experiences with education seemed exemplary of the film's highlighted troubles. Administrative bloat, listless and negligent teachers. Aside from an extremely brief bit by Randy Weingarten, who was head of the largest teachers union in the country, the whole film was really missing the voices of the most crucial stakeholders whom the film puts under scrutiny. Rather than giving the opportunity for the teachers, administrators, or unionists to defend themselves, the filmmakers decided to tell that side of the story by invoking well-known caricatures, the lazy government bureaucrat or the government-dependent welfare queen. To be as charitable as possible to the filmmakers, I believe them when they say that their film is not a flat-out endorsement of charter schools.
The critics and the skeptics and the inside baseball people are saying, the movie is like a love letter to charters. I don't believe that. This is about how do you make every school great.
Instead, they say that charter schools are simply better environments in which you can assemble the very ingredients to success.
What you see in my movie are the high-performing charters. Those high-performing charters hold the ingredients. They're like an incubator for great ideas. Those charters hold the ingredients to make great schools everywhere. And the ingredients are not that hard if you take away some of these restrictions.
Ingredients make a better pizza. That's why there's everyone else's pizza and Papa John.
The then CEO of Participant Media lays it out.
Immerse the students in a rigorous curriculum, which means there has to be some evaluation, testing of performance. If you do, and you put the best people on the front line, both administrative, teachers, and principals, you're going to have success in any type of environment, in a trailer in the parking lot.
Basically, fixing education is just about the recipe. And you found out that poop was in the ingredients. All you gotta do is take the poop out. But here's the biggest problem. If you really look at education, it's not about the ingredients. It's about the kitchen. And arguably, the kitchen's on fire. There's one scene, one moment where any support for the film's arguments should evaporate. It is here he actually considers the question of external factors to educational success. What happens outside the schools? What role does poverty play? He basically dismisses the subject completely.
For generations, experts tended to blame failing schools on failing neighborhoods. But reformers have begun to believe the opposite, that the problems of failing neighborhoods might be blamed on failing schools.
It is arguably the most important question, but this is pretty much all he devotes to this issue and puts the subject to rest immediately. You are then left to infer, after the rest of the film's arguments, that any further discussion on this matter is rather unnecessary, that poverty is less of a factor and more of a convenient dodge, and that failing teachers and administrators can no longer hide behind socioeconomic problems to absolve their own responsibility in poor student outcomes. There's lots of takedown literature of Waiting for Superman's arguments, but sociologist Robert Putnam, in his book Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis, I thought offers the strongest and fairest counter. It really shows how socioeconomic factors are real, almost too powerful in predicting success. He frames it well with a very sobering question. Are bad schools causes of inequality, or are they simply sites of inequality? Dig a little bit deeper past education, you'll find that it is well worth examining deeper issues of social mobility and all the various contextual factors for a student's achievement. By the end of it, you would feel ridiculous if you're still trying to explain away failure by complaining about bad teachers. Reformers won't deny that poverty makes it much harder to educate a child. Michelle Rhee made this clear at her various speaking engagements at Ivy League business schools.
When kids are living in abject poverty, does it make it harder for them to come to school ready to learn every day? Absolutely. But can we use poverty as an excuse for why kids aren't performing at high? No.
But really, no matter how you spin it, parental wealth is still the most reliable predictor of social mobility than bad schools, and that gap has, in recent decades, become much more stark. Yes, richer parents pay for better schools, test prep tutors, etc., but that only scratches the surface when you stop looking at the things bought by wealth and start looking at things that are associated with wealth. Let me explain what I mean. Wealthy parents tend to be highly involved in their child's success early on in life, with time, money, energy, etc. The simple act of exposing kids to words via reading them books or putting them in educational daycare centers when they're off at work, or just by talking to them a lot. They have huge effects on early development. Researchers see that this forms a massive opportunity gap already large by the time children enter kindergarten. And funny enough, that gap does not seem to change as much as children progress through school. Meaning, success and failure seems to happen even before kids enter school. The effect of K through 12 thereafter seems to do relatively less to change their trajectory. And between rich and poor, guess whose kids enter the system with disadvantage? But beyond parents' time, money, and energy, what about geography? It is 2020, and many people know, as many people don't know, that we still live in an era of segregation along lines of race and class. Right under our noses, we are still dealing with the effects of segregation after Brown v. Board of Education, brought on by things like redlining, the barring of African Americans from living in certain neighborhoods, white flight, the growth of the suburbs. The result forms a phenomenon called residential sorting, and it's not a passive legacy, not some floating remnant of segregationist history, but it's actively maintained today through subconscious behavior. Segregation is technically illegal, but if you want to do it, you don't use your voice, you use your feet. How many times have you heard someone say, "Oh, my family moved here because of the schools"? I'm sure most say that with genuine and admirable intentions, in search of better opportunities for their own kids. But there is a fine line, as many others take it a step further, and it really shows when they actively prevent others from doing the same. Back in 2015, Nicole Hannah-Jones wrote a rather revealing portrait of this in action. When a predominantly black school, one district over, shut down, and white districts needed to accommodate the stranded students, the reaction was unsavory.
I deserve to not have to worry about my children getting stabbed or taking a drug or getting robbed.
We don't want the different areas, I'm going to probably be very kind, coming across on our side of the bridge, bringing with it everything that we're fighting today against.
This is not a race issue. And I just want to say to, if she's even still here, the first woman who came up here and cried that it was a race issue, I'm sorry, that's her prejudice calling me a racist because my skin is white and I'm concerned about my children's education and safety.
We moved out here specifically to get away from the element that is now being brought into our school.
This ultra-visceral campaign to keep so-called undesirable elements from your neighborhood is not uncommon and rather shamelessly dominates local politics across the country. Perhaps school choice would be less controversial if the best of those choices weren't more readily afforded to wealthier white suburbanites. There is so much to say about the how and why we got here, but the point is, you simply cannot solve the problem of failing schools if you completely ignore our modern condition of segregation. I mean, its legacy tinges the very ground our schools are built on. Segregated neighborhoods mean segregated social connections and less interclass mixing. How do we observe that? Putnam looks at intermarriage rates across class boundaries. In other words, rich and poor people don't hang out together as much as they used to, nor end up forging connections strong enough to really go to bat for each other. Social capital, a concept which Putnam became famous for, explains how social connections are very predictive of life success. If you have time to help someone out with their homework, you would most likely do it for a friend or a relative. Everybody knows the saying, it's not about what you know, it's about who you know. But really, in the midst of all this debate, why haven't we naturally applied this truth to school achievement? And this is not to say that schools don't matter. Let's get to the schools themselves. When Putnam does look at them, he looks at way more than just your teachers. He argues that your classmates have every bit to do with your educational success. Think back to your old friendships and how they influenced your perceptions on school. Your friends could have a range of influences on you, from the positive, like good study habits, to negative, delinquency, violence, drug abuse. In fact, researchers found that classrooms characterized as high poverty had 4 times the concentration of academic, attention, and behavior problems compared to low poverty classrooms. To what extent can you blame teachers for failure if they are spending 4 times the effort babysitting behavior problems and not actually teaching? Extracurricular activities. You might think, they're important, but not that important, hence the term extra. Putnam disagrees. Controlling for family background, many studies show a link with educational attainment. More specifically, it's associated with higher GPAs, lower truancy, better work habits, higher educational aspirations, greater self-esteem, more civic engagement, like voting and volunteering, and higher earnings. This helps validate a better theory that while hard skills, like doing good in math and science, can get you far, what brings you across the finish line are experiences that cultivate your soft skills and character. To give reformers credit, he does acknowledge the body of studies showing the benefits of great teachers on student success. Waiting for Superman's arguments were solidly dependent on this line of study. One study by leading economists Chetty, Friedman, and Rockoff had been a reformer's ace up the sleeve, showing that the difference of having an effective teacher versus a bad teacher is $250,000 in lifetime earnings for their students. There is just one problem. Great teachers are disproportionately found in upper-income, high-performance schools, whereas more transient, less capable teachers are disproportionately found in lower-income, low-performance schools. National data shows this, and the fact that this problem is due less to district assignment of teachers and more to teacher flight. Oh, in that great Teacher High Earnings paper by Chetty, Friedman, and Rockoff, those authors in a later study found that teacher effectiveness only accounts for a very small share, 7%, of the achievement gap between poor and middle-class children. And instead, the most significant predictors of success are, you guessed it, socioeconomic factors like family and geography. Robert Putnam sums up his conclusion on schools like this. Do K-12 schools make the opportunity gap better or make it worse? The answer is this. The gap is created more by what happens to kids before they get to school, by things that happen outside of school, and by what kids bring or don't bring with them to school, some bringing resources and other bringing challenges, than by what schools do to them. No one is denying that ineffective teachers and management are going to tank a school's success. But truth is, context is a pain in the ass, and the deeper you examine it, the deeper you realize that our context is segregation, racism, and worsening class inequality. In other words, you will quickly realize that simply purging your organization of crappy principals and teachers probably won't change the social conditions that got you the crappy principals and teachers in the first place. Perhaps this is something Davis Guggenheim regrettably realized later on. Waiting for Superman certainly did its job, gaslighting the viewer just a little by flipping the variables. You thought poor neighborhoods lead to poor schools? What if I told you poor schools lead to poor neighborhoods? Mind blown. But to you audience members who felt like socioeconomics was tragically ignored in this film, the dust is now settled, and it turns out you weren't crazy. Turns out you were right all along. Accountability. A major tenet of both this film and the school reform movement is the importance of accountability.
There's a complete and utter lack of accountability.
Know that if you apply the right accountability standards, you can get fabulous results.
So how does this work in education? Enter the era of standards and testing. If you want to run an effective organization, you can do so by holding your professionals to a set of standards, goals, or benchmarks. Such as the basis of a meritocracy: reward those who meet and exceed those standards or punish those who fall short. How else would you know if people are doing their jobs? The reformers have argued that accountability was nowhere to be found in the existing system. Failing schools were allowed to remain open, bad teachers allowed to remain on payroll, and teachers' unions allowed to rampantly dole out sweet, unearned job security.
The guy asked me, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to fire these people." My staff is in the back of the room going like this, like, "Man, you can't fire nobody, you can't."
This is how Waiting for Superman helped burnish the reputation of DC school chancellor Michelle Rhee, brought in not for any prior school administration experience, but for her promise to punish complacency and cleanse the education system of its decay.
The bottom line is, I don't believe that you are going to be the leader who is going to take this school in the direction that we need it to go in, and have the highest expectations for the kids.
As embodied in Michelle Rhee's Take No Prisoner, Zero Tolerance persona, her Time magazine cover metaphorically suggesting that bad teachers are pests, rodents, dirt, to be cleansed. As a side note, I have come to find metaphors for cleansing systems of undesirable people as kind of disturbing. So think about it. You are now chancellor or superintendent in charge of a major school system, and you want to implement our accountability principles to police bad teaching. To establish standards, you need rigorous data collection, perhaps a universal, non-biased algorithm to benchmark teacher performance. Let's use rates of improvement or decline in student proficiency tests. Base the data collection on recommendations by Ivy League university researchers, backed by generous grants from foundations, and give it a sleek name like Value Added Measurement System, or VAM. No, VAM. No, not WHAM. Not WHAM, VAM. The problem? Well, your quantitative system is really high stakes. A teacher's salary, even whether or not they can keep their job, can largely be determined by a number spit out by a machine. Data algorithms aren't always accurate, reliable, nor unbiased. And even if they were, there's absolutely no way you or your colleagues can know that for sure. That information is proprietary knowledge, belonging to the overpriced data science consultants you hired to perform the evaluations in the first place. These problems are not hypothetical. In fact, they were well argued in Cathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Math Destruction, which makes a very strong case about the societal damages caused by our blind faith in data. In it, she tells the story of truly effective, high-performing teachers, vetted by their peers, who have gotten hosed by these value-added systems. In many cases, data benchmarking does a piss-poor job of accounting for context. The system had little way of knowing if you're teaching English language learners, troubled students, or students with special needs. Championed by RE in DC, it was eventually implemented in many parts of the US, mandated by states or local school systems to track teacher performance. But in retrospect, according to what we know now, VAM was not a huge success. Organized opposition by teachers and administrators began to surface. I just have to point out the name of this blog dedicated strictly to fighting VAM. Absolutely savage. Okay, by 2015, legislation to implement these evaluation systems started getting rolled back. No Child Left Behind was modified by the Every Student Succeeds Act to eliminate federal support for using the algorithm. Court cases in Long Island struck down VAM as, quote, arbitrary and capricious. In Houston, a court ruled against its usage, concluding that if you get fired based on an algorithm, of which no one really knows how it works, that you're effectively denying that teacher due process. But what was it all for? By the end of the decade, dependency on VAM declined, along with many other top-down technical instruments applied to schools in the name of accountability and standardization. Things like Common Core or Obama-era programs such as Race to the Top, and other programs led by philanthropists like Bill Gates. In my experience working with teachers, most will tell you that good teaching is just as much an art form as it is a science. They'll also tell you that it is hard for standardized tests to fully grasp the idiosyncrasies of a classroom. When reading about the movement to push for standards and accountability, I felt more confounded. The camp pushing for more creativity and innovation in the classroom seemed like the same camp that was pushing for teachers to be strictly results and metrics oriented, to teach to a test, and to do so out of fear of losing their jobs. A revealing scene in Waiting for Superman illustrated this strange contradiction, depicting teaching as a process of pouring a goo substance into a kid's skull, as if it were akin to manual labor with production quotas. The suggestion was the only thing keeping great teachers down were onerous union regulations, rather than, say, the myriad other things like behavioral problems in the classroom, overly meddlesome parents, or worse, VAM assessments. To be clear, this is not to indict the practice of standardization, testing, and data-focused metrics. They do have their place. I want to stress that VAM itself wasn't the problem. Rather, the problem was the orthodoxy of business thinking that VAM represented. To reduce a field as complicated and deep as education into a simple matter of balance sheets and data trackers, things typical of the business realm.
10% of teachers are bad.
Where'd you get that number?
I don't know. 10% of people in any profession maybe should think of something else. Right?
Well, okay, but I mean, maybe you're a shitty cameraman. I don't know.